you said that Stoics never actually spoke about emotions, and that's another matter of definitions, right? They never spoke about the emotions in the sense that we speak about emotions today. And I'd really appreciate it if you could kind of elaborate on that, because I think that that was a real revelation to me, to understand that, and I think it's going to be really helpful for our listeners as well.
Yeah, sure. So really, I mean, it was a kind of a point of translation, right? We
Mm.
talk about emotions in modern English, and we lump all sorts of things under that label. And it's quite a broad, ill-defined kind of concept. What is an emotion, right?
Mm.
It's something going on in your head that's not rational. I mean, I don't know. I genuinely don't know how to define what an emotion is,
Yeah.
in the kind of everyday colloquial English sense of the word. But when the Stoics are talking about what we often translate as emotions, when they talk about pathe, they're using it in a very technical sense. It's very, very precise, and they know exactly what they're referring to. And I think it's much, much narrower than what we would think of as emotions in that
Mm.
loose English sense of the word.
Mm.
So, obviously, the emotions that they're concerned about are what we might call negative emotions. They also think there are positive emotions, which are good. So they're not rejecting all emotion. That's kind of one thing we'd want to say. And the other thing is they have this account of first movements, right? Which they don't think count as emotions, but they include all sorts of things that we might think of as emotional responses, right? So sort of fight or flight, fear responses would count as first movements. Seneca, in his book on anger, when he talks about emotions there, he'll say that crying isn't an emotion in the
Mm.
Stoic sense of the word, right? If
Yeah.
you're suddenly taken aback by something and you burst into tears, that's not being emotional. That's just a kind of a reflexive response.
Yeah.
Um, so a real emotion in the Stoic sense, a pathe, is something that is the product of a value judgment and
Mm.
something that hangs around for a long time. So, for instance, someone who loses a relative and goes through a process of grief. I mean, Seneca would say that there's a sense in which that's just a natural process.
Mm.
That's not necessarily an emotion in the Stoic sense of the word. I mean,
Mm.
it's just natural and normal and proper to be affected by that, to cry, to have those immediate responses.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, he said
it,
like it would be inhuman if you didn't feel it, right? It's like
absolutely.
it just
Yeah.
wouldn't be natural.
Yeah. But the person who 2 or 3 years later is still convinced that what happened was an absolute travesty, and is in a kind of pathological state of grief,
Mm.
the sort that a modern psychotherapist would say this is something unhealthy. That's the sort of thing that the Stoics have got in mind when they talk about pathe, something that becomes debilitating, something that's based on a mistaken judgment.
Mm.
Um, so it's very, very specific. It's much, much narrower than what when we think about emotions. So one way around this would be to translate their word pathe as passion.
Yeah.
And in the early modern period, so in the 17th century, it was often translated as passion. And I think for a while, people thought that that sounded a bit antiquated. So people use emotion instead, but that's not ideal either. So I think really it's just being sensitive to the fact that our English words don't necessarily capture the ancient ideas, the
Yeah.
Greek terms precisely.